On tap today, we have Kieren McCarthy. How you doing, good sir?
I'm good.
I am so glad to have you here. You are a talent with the Register,
That's right.
and I some of my viewers are not going to be super familiar with your work or this topic. So give me just a second to kind of give a very top level basic explanation, and then I'd like you to fill in whatever details you think are most relevant. Okay?
Sure.
Okay, so I got to know your work through this project called the Atari VCS. And people who don't follow this stuff might think of Atari as this company that made a video game system 40 years ago. That's not who I'm talking about. The company we now call Atari is basically three guys who bought the rights to the name on the cheap and decided to market a new game system. And what they delivered was, to make a long story short, a barely functioning computer with some very unimpressive software on it. And I'd like you to kind of take over from that, because what you did was you actually talked to the people and had some very interesting conversations with them.
I did. Well, I mean, where do you begin? You begin when it got announced, which was during the summer 2017. And I don't often write about games and games consoles, but, like a lot of people, I had an Atari when I was a kid, and I heard that they've got they're bringing out a new Atari Box, they called it at the time, this sort of retro console. And I thought that was a fun story. And I knew that the sort of the Register readers would be interested. So I wrote this little piece when they announced it. I was a little skeptical, but I figured it was almost certainly going to be like the console that the NES Classic console that they came out with. They basically came out. You remember the NES Classic was these classic consoles from my youth, and they came out with one. I thought, oh, they'll do that. That's actually a pretty good idea. It'll cost $60 or something. And so I wrote a story about it. I was a little skeptical, seeing as I looked into Atari, and I thought, I'm pretty sure Atari died a while ago. So I looked at it, and it had. I mean, and it was pretty much an IP company. But I thought, if they're smart about this, there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to build a new games console. A little complicated, but there's emulators out there. They could do it and make it look nice, and everyone would get a bit of nostalgia. Could be fun. They've got the IP rights for the Atari games, so why not? So so I thought this would be fun. It was just a little story, and then they sort of put out some updates on it, which were a little odd. So I dug into it a little bit deeper, and I realized that, oh, hang on, there's something not right about this. They started talking about how it was going to be the same as a PC console. It was going to be sort of have 4K, and it was going to. And I thought that's a crazy idea, especially with the PlayStation coming up, which was then going to be a year away, and the new Xbox. And I thought that's absolutely crazy. What are they thinking? That's not going to work. They need to do this retro console. But anyway, that's up to them. And then they announced they were going to be at the Games Developer Conference. Oh, no, then they announced they were going to launch, which I thought was highly improbable, given that this is a piece of hardware. And it's quite a lot of work to produce a piece of hardware. And they reckon they were going to launch it within 6 months. I thought, there's no way this is going to happen. And sure enough, it didn't. So literally the day before they said they were going to launch, they canceled it. So that was a huge red flag. And I thought, well, that's that idea. That's dead. And then a few months after that, 2018, they said, oh, we're going to be at the Games Developer Conference in San Francisco. So my interest was piqued. So I thought, oh, I'll go. And obviously, we're based in the Bay Area, or our office is. So it was actually quite simple. If it had been one of the Games Developer, one of the other games conferences across the world, I wouldn't have bothered. But seeing as it was in San Francisco, which was my backyard, I thought, I'll go and find out. And that's when I ended up sort of in this, not in the actual games conference, but in this suite in the hotel, the Marriott, just sort of over the road from Moscone, which I immediately thought was odd. And it was just inside a hotel room. And the implication was that, there would be this prototype. And then I had the strangest conversation with their Atari COO, Michael Arts. And it very quickly dawned on me that this guy didn't know what the hell he was doing at all. I mean, at all. And so I had this weird conversation where I went, I thought, oh, this would be fun, and sat down And I said, and none of it worked. I mean, at all. And it was just a box, and it was quite a heavy box. And I said, so what's in it? And he couldn't tell me. I asked basic questions, what's the interface? Couldn't tell me. How's this work? Couldn't tell me. Then it picked up the control, and it was literally a molded piece of plastic. And then then there's the classic Atari controller. So I picked that up, and I said, oh, because it moved. Does this work? No. Well, so I just kept asking questions, and it became very clear very quickly that he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. He was talking about, he was saying this was, like trying to launch, he was talking about NASA. And I said, this isn't NASA, this is a games console. And then how he couldn't show me things. And they were thinking about getting a new chip and all this stuff, which I imagine would, if people were excited about it and didn't really know much about hardware or product development or technology, i.e. weren't a tech journalist, that they might go for. I mean, he was sort of excited about it, winging it a bit. But when he literally couldn't answer any questions at all, I thought, this is a total bust. These guys, they don't know what they're doing. They put out an idea and they got a lot of interest, and they did. They raised millions of dollars on Indiegogo. And so I thought, they don't know what they're doing. So I wrote an article basically saying, this is never going to happen. This is a disaster. The COO doesn't know what he's doing. And they got very upset about that. I didn't realize until months later. I imagined they'd been upset by it, but that's not my problem. Except then someone sent me a message months later, which said they are calling you a troll on their Facebook page. So they're launching again, trying to get more money for this concept, which they clearly hadn't even started. And someone found my article and said, can you explain this, why your COO doesn't understand any of these fundamental factors? And they wrote this response, which was, well, I suppose something like, you get irresponsible trolls. And it really, really slagged off my article, saying that I had written a story that I wanted to write rather than one that was actually happened or discussed. So this got under my skin as a professional journalist, but fortunately I'd recorded the whole thing. So I dug out, fortunately I still had it. I have tapes of most of my interviews. So I dug out the interview, and we posted a story in which I just put the full interview up, audio, and it was quite good audio because I had a good recording device, and I also split it up. And so each bullet point where, I just went through each bullet point of my story and put the audio underneath it. Basically, I wrote exactly what happened. So at that point, I imagine Atari was very irritated, but you can't go around accusing professional journalists of being trolls, especially when you've got a tape of it. So from that point on, I thought, right, I would just follow this thing to the death. And so every couple of months, it would occur to me, I wonder what's happening with the Atari VCS. So that's what I did. Every couple of months, I would look in and basically write a story going, oh my God, it's got worse. And it just got worse and worse and worse. And the price point kept going up to the point where it was almost the same as a new PlayStation. And then the specs wouldn't come out. And then when the specs did come out, it was so woefully underpowered. It was clearly not going to be able to do anything. And then I heard a rumor that they were having major production problems. So I started reaching out to people and found out that the guy that they'd hired to do the basic design, the entire box, had just quit. So he'd quit. And so I contacted him and said, I'd like to know what's going on. He couldn't tell me a lot was going on, but he said, I have quit because they haven't paid me for 6 months. So then once I realized this was a total fiasco, I called up everybody that was connected to Atari to find out what was going on. And I got the lowdown on what the actual system was going to do and how far it progressed. And it was a mess. It was a big mess. But I didn't think that it was, I didn't think that they wouldn't ever put anything out. There were some people online at this point who said it was a scam. They reckoned it was a scam. I never thought it was a scam. I just thought they didn't know what the hell they were doing. And they didn't. And eventually it sort of launched, having said they were going to launch it a couple of times, it sort of launched in the end. And it's exactly what everyone that followed it closely thought it would be, which is an unfortunately underpowered Linux box with a not great user interface and no original games. And I feel kind of sorry for people that spent a lot of money getting one. But some of them I've tracked them online. Some of them seem quite happy with it, so that's good. But I mean, what a wasted opportunity.
It really is. And there's so much to unpack there. And there's not a whole lot of people who are taking the position that you are taking, that this is not a typical launch. There's a lot of things here that should have been red flags. I mean, just for the start of it, this practice of going to a major convention and not actually purchasing space there at the convention, but instead going to a hotel room across the street, it's not unheard of, but it's generally considered to be an unseemly thing to do.
It's just not what you would do
No.
if you were a professional company. No one, only the shadiest people will set themselves up adjacent to a conference without anything in the actual conference. Now, I mean, I go to conferences, or used to before the pandemic, all the time. And yes, executives will set up in a hotel suite away from the conference center for one-on-one interviews. It's much quieter. You can arrange it. You've got a space. That makes perfect sense. But you never launch a product in a hotel room. Especially if you're building around a conference, you get an exhibition and you show your customers. So immediately that I realized I was going to a suite in a hotel and not to the actual conference itself, I was suspicious.
And I mean, I remember their original marketing materials when it was still the Atari Box was something to the effect of play, game, and stream like never before. And what they delivered was not only what had come before, it was something you could have put together in your garage out of spare parts if you had a mind to do it. They were always promising far more than they could even hope to deliver.
I think they didn't know what they were going to do. They put out this concept. I'm pretty sure that it started because you remember when the new Blade Runner was announced, and they had the big trailer, and everyone was very excited about that. And obviously, one of the most famous bits is the Atari logo in Blade Runner, weirdly, because it's actually only a very small part of it, but it's just a famous scene. And they really amped that up in the new trailer. So I think Fred Chesney, who is now Atari CEO, saw that and thought, oh my God, here is a perfect opportunity. And he was right. And then if you think about it, running a retro Atari box, especially if you kept the wood paneling that was it was actually a really smart idea. So the concept was really good, I think. And so they put it out there, and it took off obviously much more than they thought it would. And then, of course, it must have dawned on them, oh my God, we actually have to build a games console. And building a games console sounds easy, but it's not. It's just not. To build a whole console with hardware, custom hardware, that's a difficult thing. And they haven't the slightest idea how to do it. They're not hardware guys. They're marketing guys. Always have been marketing guys. So there was immediately a big ask, and they didn't do a good job of it. They wanted to find an easy route, and then they put an Indiegogo and they raised millions of dollars, and I thought they couldn't believe their luck. And at some point, and I'd love to talk to them about it, but I doubt if they'll ever be honest about it. At some point, they went from what they should have done, which was create a retro box and sell it and just recognize that that's their market, to deciding they were going to create their own games console. I have proper games console, and I have no idea what happened in that meeting. That was such an obviously terrible decision, which makes me think that there's only 2-3 people actually deciding this, but that was an obviously terrible decision, and that's why it took years to come to market, and when it did come to market, it was overpriced and underpowered.
I can speculate as to what would happen and how that came to be. I mean, my personal thought is that they just decided that they wanted to get $300 for each box, and they just worked backwards as to what they'd have to cram in there to justify that price tag.
It's very possible. It's very possible. And the logic of it was so faulty that it can only have been driven by greed. It just doesn't make sense to have gone the route they went. And and it was so obvious it wasn't even difficult. It's not like my understanding of the games market is outstanding. It's not. I'm not a games journalist. I don't spend all that time digging into the workings, but it was pretty obvious that this was a bad decision. So yeah, I think the most logical explanation is they just thought, why charge $60 when we could charge $200? That's the only obvious explanation for it.
And the fact that you're not per se a games journalist, if that's not your bread and butter, that just underscores the point I was trying to go for earlier, is that it wasn't difficult to recognize just how poorly this was run by even a layperson.
No.
We're in an age now where electronics developments is kind of a part of our lives. We all want to, when's the new phone coming out? Because my old one's got a cracked screen. And we kind of have a sense for how these things happen. And even the most non-technical person could say, if they want to launch this thing in 6 months and don't even have specs written down, that's a problem.
Well, I mean, I'm not a games journalist, but I am a tech journalist, and I've been for a long time. And I have covered, I don't know how many hundreds of product launches. And so I mean, I distinctly remember being impressed, for example, when Google first produced its hardware, it had a big product launch. And the thing that it did a pretty good job, that Google hardware. But the thing that I was impressed with, that they'd managed to keep it so quiet for so long, and then I was talking to the main guy that they hired, and they'd been working on it for 2 years, hard 2 years. Not, I don't know when the concept had been born, but it was probably 5 years before that. But they'd been working hard on it for 2 years. So the concept that you would, decide in June to make some hardware and that it would exist in December is so ludicrous. So as a tech journalist, it wasn't even sort of intellectually working it through. It's just like, I've literally never seen anybody do this. And so there's this company of 3 people. They claim 10, but it's 3. There is no way they can ever do this. And sure enough, they couldn't.
They couldn't. And the weird thing is, like I was saying, it was obvious to anybody there were red flags. You pointed them out, but you were one of the very few voices of reason in the wilderness when all the much bigger sites, going to try to avoid naming names, were just like, yeah, here's what's coming out and here's what Atari says. And they were basically regurgitating the advertising. Why is it coverage like yours was so rare to find when the facts were so clear?
Yeah, I don't know. I despair a little. I mean, the tech journalism has always been frustrating, especially in the United States. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from the UK. So I was tech journalist in the UK for many, many years before I moved over to the US. And the UK is a little more aggressive with its journalism, a little bit more skeptical. In the US, across journalism, I would say, there's this much looser approach where you sort of give the corporation the benefit of the doubt. There's this sort of willingness to cheerlead, to be excited about products, whereas in Europe it's a little bit more cynical, a little bit more critical. So there is that, but the games industry in particular does seem to be pretty poor in the sense that people rarely apply critical thinking to what happens. There's a lot of cheerleading that happens in the games press. Now, what I would say, which I found was an eye-opener to me, was I ended up talking to various YouTubers, and the YouTubers were pretty good on this. In fact, some of them were excellent on the critical aspects of this. But in terms of the traditional online press, used to be magazines, etc., it amazed me that they would keep writing these stories that were glowing. And even when Atari just kept pushing out press releases over 2 years, 3 years, And every time they did, it was just written about non-critically. And even though the simplest Google search would have brought up my articles pointing out all the flaws with it, there was just this willingness to just write happy nonsense, which I can only assume is because you sort of, if you are in that business, um, you're sort of dependent on companies giving you the information. And they're a little aggressive about it sometimes. They definitely are aggressive in the tech industry. They will cut you off if you do something that they don't like. This happens all the time. The registers got blacklisted by Apple and at various times other big tech companies because they think that that's their leverage, their power. They get you to write something, sort of less critical, and they do this all the time. The games industry is, because it's quite a tight industry, it's harder to get information unless you have the companies on your side. So I think what they end up doing is they're so reliant on the actual companies for information and pictures and videos and interviews and the latest information that I think they end up realizing they can't be, or there's no value in being critical. And then I think they end up, after a long period of time, just uncritically producing stuff that is shiny. And if it gets the hits and gets the advertisers, then I'm sure they can justify that to themselves. But yeah, you're right. The lack of critical thinking in the tech press, in the games press, was pretty depressing. It was pretty obvious this was bad. And there were a few carefully skeptical stories, but a huge number of simple cheerleading stories. But that said, the guys that really shone and did a better job than me were the YouTubers who follow this all the time. And some of them were extremely caustic and quite funny. And I ended up subscribing to their feeds because, and I like gaming, but I'm not a massive gamer. I do like to play games occasionally, but I ended up subscribing to some of these guys' feeds because they were really good. They were doing as close to journalism as I was doing. A little bit more entertainment and sort of personality driven, but sure, I mean, that's YouTube. So I will call them out. They did a good job. Who am I thinking of? Pat the NES Punk and Tech Review USA. Those guys, they did good. They did good. But no, mainstream games press, C. I'd give them a C.
I'd definitely give Pat and Ian a tap Pat on the shoulder there. Ian's actually been on the show, so
Yeah,
big fan of those guys.
they're good.
And even going back to the very early days of the Atari Box, which is now 3 years ago, I want to say.
Yeah,
It wasn't our first rodeo. This was a movie we had seen before. There was the Coleco Chameleon,
yeah.
and the Polymega had already been announced, and I think there were even going to be whispers of the Amico very soon. And there was a pattern that nobody was seeing, is that, like you just said, these guys would come out and they would be pushing information out there. They would be literally shoving it down every media path they could find until somebody would ask a critical question, and then they were too busy. They were working on stuff. They couldn't be reached for comment. And this was almost to a T. It was like the same person was running all these projects because the behavior was the same. And yet nobody would draw the connection that the same result's going to happen.
Yeah, I think it's just gamers get excited about stuff. It's just the sort of the mindset is to be excited, and there's a kind of, and it's quite a nice culture to have in many respects. But you have the super critical gamer community, and then you have the gamer community that just thinks that everything's, it's fun. Let them see what happens. And the thing about games is, the magic about games is that you never quite know when something's going to be amazing. And so the beauty of games, it happens, and we could probably all name the games that it happens to, but you'll hear about a game and suddenly out of the blue it appears and it's outstanding. And then you dedicate a huge chunk of your life for the next couple of months to playing that game. So there's a kind of a magic to games. They're so immersive, and when someone does a good job, they're so remarkable, and they sort of pull you into a world that I think there's just sort of this generalized recognition that people occasionally pull things out the bag. And so I think gamers always kind of want that to be the case. And so there's a lot of, in some cases, goodwill that shouldn't be there. So I think a lot of gamers, and I think this is why these bad consoles keep popping up and people keep believing in them, is because they might just pull it off. It's that sort of belief. This might be, the next great thing. And so a lot of people will back that up. So the people who should be torn down, like this Atari VCS, should have fallen over and everyone should have ignored it and insisted on getting their money back. But because people wanted it to believe that they might just pull it off, every time they did something, they got more backing, and there's no shortage of people on Reddit forums, etc., that keep supporting the Atari, even when it became obvious that it was going to be a mess. They kept supporting it. So I think that's what drives people, is that they just know if they can tap that enthusiasm, when the enthusiasm tends to not come with critical thinking, then they can make money. And I think part of them believe it too. Part of them believe that they also might pull this off. But it is weird how it happens again and again. I have a lot of people asking me to weigh in on this Amico thing, which looks like another disaster. And so far, I've steered clear of it because I've seen it before. And that's part of, if I thought this was a new thing, or if I thought it would have much impact, me writing about it, or if it would save people from being ripped off, then I'd weigh in. But if people haven't figured it out by now, they're not going to.
I'm not sure exactly where I'm seeing the distinction. But I think with the Atari, because it was a bigger brand, they had a little bit more of the trappings of a formal launch. I think enough people were just seeing the name and writing it off that they got their $3 million. I kind of wish they hadn't, but they did. And there was this thought that they might just take that money and disappear. They managed to get something out, and that's all well and good. But I think with the Amico, there are enough things working against it that the idea of them just having this runaway Indiegogo is, I just don't see that happening. I don't see them having the same level of success before or after they ship that even the Atari VCS did.
No, I don't see it. I mean, the truth is, the size of the story, because it was Atari, and it was Atari, albeit an IP shell of a company. That's a definite story. The Amico is a games industry story. I don't think it's going to come to much at all, and it could just not happen at all. I think Atari was obligated to put something out there, otherwise their entire company would be, people would never trust it again. And also, it's worth pointing out that Atari doesn't just do this; they push literally anything that they can. They came up with this concept of gaming hotels, and they'd have, people would pay to play Atari games in hotel rooms, and everyone wrote about that as if it was a good idea. It's a rubbish idea. It's a terrible idea, an obviously terrible idea. So people wrote about it, and so they imagine, if you get a lot of press coverage, you think we could do this. And then they also came up with their own cryptocurrency. I mean, that was equally ludicrous. And they could come out with ludicrous branding, anything that sounds fresh and hot. I'm sure Fred Chesney imagines himself to be a great entrepreneur, but I mean, he's doing pretty poorly. In fact, I haven't written it. I should have dug into this more. I spoke to someone who was on talking of wild Atari tangents, who was on a game show that was sponsored by Atari a few years ago. And it was based on some Atari game, and they were flown out to somewhere, and they did a game show, proper game show, and with contestants, and you'd win X amount of dollars, and all the contestants on this show ended up having to fight to get what they were, the money that they had won. The whole thing was just appalling, and I've spoken to one person, and I don't know why I didn't write up the full story, but they branded into producing a game show, but every single time, the one connection every time is people have to sue for their money. So The Atari VCS architect had to sue for his money. I don't think he's got it yet. A previous guy that they worked with that came up with the Atari VCS had to sue for his money, and they settled out of court. These game show people had to sue for their money, and when they sued, they got it. And there was another case. Everyone's having to sue Atari. So they come up with grand schemes, implement them, they don't take off, and then they don't pay people. That's happened again and again and again. So that's why it was an interesting story. But these other games consoles, will they happen? Well, there's a strong likelihood that they won't ever exist, not even in a bad, underpowered version. So I don't quite know what drives people to put their money on it. I really don't. But people get excited about stuff.
I try not to wish ill on any particular project, even when I know it's just a bad idea. I kind of make an exception when I can see obvious intent to deceive, like with the Coleco Chameleon and this DVR card and the Jag shell. It's like, you're obviously just fooling people to get their money at that point. I don't mind ragging on you.
Yeah.
When it's a passion project from somebody, misguided as it may be, I hesitate to really just totally punch them in the face.
Yeah.
But I will advise people, if you think this is cool, if you think it's a great idea and you want one, wait till it's on the shelf and you can just pick it up before you buy one.
Yeah, but then see, the thing is, it's always well pitched in the, it's the whole Indiegogo mindset. What's the other one? The other main crowdsourcing. It's this concept of you're part of the team and you're making it happen, which I get. It's exciting. Kickstarter, that's what I was trying to think of. And I've done a few Kickstarters in my time, and it's kind of exciting to be part of that. Like, I've got this great idea, but I need the money to do it. And there is something really satisfactory about that. And I think if you're a big gamer, there's something really enjoyable about making something happen, giving someone a bit of money and them going and making it happen. So I think that's what people get excited about. And you kind of know when you do it that it's a punt. So I think there's a whole element of people thinking, am I willing to lose this money to it? And so I think that's why there isn't the same level of outrage that you would imagine there should be. I think people half know in their hearts it's a bit of a gamble. And so they're willing to do it. And then, of course, it's sort of the strange thing is it turns around a bit at that point, because now they've put their money in. So now they feel the need to defend it. So, so it's a kind of a strange situation that you end up in. But there's a lot of funny people in the world. I mean, well, without sort of naming people, I'm sure there's passion behind it. I'm sure it's not just this concept of a quick buck. There's real passion there. But those sorts of people are often not very good at recognizing their own limitations. So if they're feeling particularly florid, they might imagine this situation in which they produce this games console and it takes over and they get bought out by Apple. And I imagine that's what drives, because it requires an enormous amount of energy to launch a product and a company. It is very hard to do. It requires a constant energy. And so I think you have to be that sort of person to willing, especially to create a new thing. But those sorts of people, especially if they don't have something like a board of directors or even just sort of investors keeping their feet to the fire. If it's just lots and lots of people giving you X number of dollars over Indiegogo, there's no real accountability. So I think that type of personality can just go flying off in strange directions. And then criticism feels really harsh to them. So they tend to react badly. And then, of course, you get someone like me who isn't invested in the actual console, but in the story. And that tends to really get under their skin, because I'm just looking at it purely objectively and say, this isn't going to work. And the problem is, by being objective, it adds more value than someone getting upset. I don't get upset. I'm just being a journalist. So I think that strange dynamic. And I'm a little wary about weighing in on the smaller ones, because I know if I did really weigh in, I could really destroy their chances of it happening at all. So I'm a little wary about weighing in the same way you're talking about going in for all guns blazing. I'm not going to sit and write a half a story You know, if I do it, I'll write a story and I would dig into each aspect of it. And I'm pretty confident that some of these games consoles would not survive that level of scrutiny. So I tend to steer clear unless I think it's important.
Yeah, and I said you've written several articles on the VCS, each of which I'm going to put in the show notes. So if somebody wants to follow the story from your perspective, they'll be able to do that. But you're right; you can't just pick and choose your battles. If you can't go in halfway. And like I said, I could see once when somebody's holding up an empty shell and they're saying this is our idea for a games console, and you're saying it's a hunk of plastic. What specifically are we even talking about here?
Yeah,
that can be called out. Another, the couple of the others I mentioned, they might not work. They might not be a great idea, but I think that there's at least an effort to build what they say they're going to build. Whether anybody wants that is a different question. But I'm not convinced Atari actually intended to go through with this. My thought, and this is just me speculating, was that they were gunning for a buyout. They were trying to make a project that would give them enough of a position to be bought out by another company. And then somebody else will be on the hook to deliver the Atari box.
That's not a bad strategy. If I can go back in time and think about it, it was not a bad strategy if that was their strategy. What they should have done, if that was their goal, was actually produce the damn thing for $60, $75, and had it be a success. And then that would have got a lot of attention from people that would have bought them out. Some VC company, or even just a larger company that thinks we can do something with this brand. Look what they did. But they have to demonstrate. People tend to think that they're going to have some kind of magic, lucky moment in life. But the truth is, even when you're told stories, of like this company bought out this, Facebook bought this company and they're suddenly all millionaires, and that there doesn't seem to be much behind it. There is. People have been working extremely hard for years to get to that point. Facebook doesn't go and buy a company because they like the look of it, So I think that people tend to miss that because we don't talk about it. We don't talk about the real hard work that goes into making these things. And so I think Atari is not really willing to put in the hard work. I think they launch great ideas and then they don't follow through. To have come up, they could have put in real focused attention on this Atari VCS, created a retro box, made it successful, and then sold it. I just don't think they were willing to put in the hard work, and it would have been a lot of hard work. They just outsourced it, and that came with a lot of problems.
I'm going to completely agree that they should have gone the route of having a $60 Atari. I might disagree that it would have been a lot of work, if only for one reason.
Yeah.
It already exists. There are already $60 Atari clones on the shelf now. I don't see why they couldn't have grabbed one of those, put a special packaging in there, and called it the Atari box.
Do you know what they could have done? Is they could have bought up all the old boxes. I mean, I think they probably have all the IP rights for all of that stuff. They could have bought it, handed it off to some motherboard manufacturer, said, recreate this, but stick more modern chips in, and then just come up with I doubt whether they'd be able to find the old product thing. They've had to have paid for the box and everything. They'd had to have redone that. But they could really literally have put a slightly better version of the exact same computer together and sold it with a big markup. That would have been the smart move. I have no idea what they were thinking when they decided they would go for a full-on console.
If they had taken the equivalent of an Atari flashback with, say, Netflix and Hulu added onto it, throw a 10-cent Ethernet port on there, and maybe had the option of adding other games through some means, maybe it would have been $99, and I bet they'd still be in stores today. I don't know why.
Do you know what? I would probably have bought one of them.
Me too.
I'd have bought one. I think the truth of it is, you and I say this because we have some understanding of technology and gaming and hardware. I don't think they had any understanding of that at all. Like Michael Arts, when I talked to him at this weird, hotel meeting, he was talking about chipsets, and there's another new chipset coming out, and that's even more powerful. And I said to him, there's always a new chipset. That's you don't like. It's like he was literally learning about chipsets for the first time in his life. I was like, there is literally always a new chipset. That's the entire market. You can, in 6 months' time, there'll be another new chipset. You've got to make the call, get the specs, make the call, lock it down. This is absolutely basic. So when the COO was getting excited about the concept of chipsets, I thought, he has no idea what he's doing. Absolutely no idea. So if they'd have been smart about it, they'd have hired someone who knew what they were doing. Eventually they did. It took them a long time. But we're assuming that they were more than marketing guys. They are marketing guys looking for dollars. And that's what happened. They ended up making some very bad decisions. It's a shame. It was a real opportunity.
I agree. And I don't necessarily want to be down on the pure concept of it, but it was just the way they got to the finish line. It was frustrating at how many wrong turns they took. And yet anybody who called them out was just shut down, or they were, in your case, called a liar, which is absurd.
It was absurd. But the funny thing was, I had a flash of anger, and then I just started laughing because I thought, well, this is so ludicrous. I'm pretty sure I recorded that interview. I thought they're so screwed, because I would never have just made anything up. So I remember writing the story. I remember going back to the office and say, you will not believe the conversation I just had with the COO of Atari. Like, oh, is it going to be exciting? I said, no, it's going to be an absolute disaster. So they're like, oh my God, well, what are you going to write about? I said, I'm going to write what a disaster it is. People are going to love it, So there was a kind of amusement. At the same time, I felt, initially I thought, I've just wasted basically an afternoon when I could be doing something else. But then I thought, no, this is so bad that this is just going to be a fun story and people will read it. When they started being unpleasant to me, there was initial anger, like accusing a professional journalist of lying is always going to get under their skin. But then I remembered I'd recorded it, and I thought, this is going to be so much fun because I can just put the literal recordings of this guy out there, and I listened to it, and I realized how badly he came across, and I thought, this is going to be a disaster for them. And also, I get to say, hey, professional journalist here, don't do this. Don't go around calling people fake news or irresponsible trolls. I'm not having that. So on that level, I sort of kind of enjoyed the ability to rub it in their face. I don't think it had any strong impact. People still behind it, but I hope they learned not to do that. It's just a bad idea to be unprofessional when someone is a professional. So I hope they learned that lesson.
Indeed, it's a level of professionalism, not just toward the media, which is an issue by itself, but you have to figure, if they're treating the media like that, how are they looking at their customers? Because as a potential customer of theirs, I don't feel like they treated us with any sort of sense of honesty or respect.
No, their communications were shameful. It was really bad. And also their PR company, who a pretty good PR company, were really unnecessarily aggressive. And I don't know why they did that. I think people just get big ideas, and as soon as they have some money, they imagine that they have power. But that's not really the case. You're going to have power for a very short period of time, but ultimately people will remember it. I remember everyone involved and how they reacted to people, and their credibility is significantly lower from now on. And the tech industry is fairly big. The game industry is pretty small. That will count against them for a long period of time. But I think when people have money, they kind of lose track of that, and their worst parts of their personality come out.
Agreed. I see a lot of ugliness in these kind of projects, and it's very disheartening to me as somebody who does love games, because I love games. I love passion projects. I've thrown my money behind a few Kickstarters myself, but you can start to get a feel for who has the wherewithal to actually deliver and who's just fishing for ideas, fishing for fame.
Yeah, it's easy. It's not hard. It's like anything. You know it. You know it when you see it. If
Mhm.
someone is really trying to make a product happen and they're all in on that, you can just tell because they're keen to communicate with people. They're also the toughest part is taking criticism on board from people who aren't in your organization. So that can be very hard because a lot of people won't know what's really going on. So it can be very difficult to hear criticism or critiques of what you're doing if you're in the middle of it and if you're working hard. But if someone does do that and they say to people, I hear you and here's what we're going to do about it, that's when you know you've got a strong likelihood of it happening. When they're listening, because they're thinking about the user, they're thinking about their product, that's when you know that there's a pro behind it. If they don't do that, and especially if someone critiques it and they start having a go at them, attacking them, being personally unpleasant, that's when you know you've got a crazy person behind it, that this is about their ego and not about the actual product. So it's not difficult to tell. We all instinctively know it. I think some people allow their biases to ignore what's really going on and the personality types. But in terms of identifying someone who is going to produce a good product, it's really not difficult. Are their communications good? Are they consistent? Do they update people? Do they listen to criticism in a healthy way? And that's it. And if they're doing that, there's a strong likelihood it'll happen.
I can't think of a better place to leave it. That pretty much sums up the whole experience perfectly.
It was a blast. I mean, they to be fair to them, it finally existed, and it does have a UI. It's okay. I'm not getting one. Way overpriced and massively underpowered. Not good product. But to their credit, they actually did produce it and ship it out to people. So I'll give them that. But my God, I hope they've learned from it.
Agreed. And if you happen to want one for whatever reason, it is coming your way, or you can go get it. And I'm
Yeah.
happy for you to that extent. I just think that games have been around long enough. The tech industry has been around long enough. We should have higher expectations for how companies treat their customers.
Yeah, there should be. I'd love to think that people will be a little bit harsher on the next one and the next one. I don't know. People get excited about it. Whenever there's something, I think there's going to be a fear of ripoff or there's something bad going on, I'll wade in, put a spotlight on it. But yeah, I hope everybody collectively learns a bit from this. It was a mess.
Indeed. Kieren, I'm going to set link to all your articles in the show notes here. Where can people follow you on social media?
Kieren McCarthy, at Kieren McCarthy. I've also got at Kieren, but that's my personal Twitter, or at Kieren McCarthy. Twitter is mostly where I am online. I've got pretty much everything, but I tend to avoid it. But Twitter is where I tend to be.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here, buddy. I had a great time, and I would love to have you back anytime.
Sure. Good talking.
Likewise.